Okay, we are 2 minutes after the hour. I think it makes sense to get started. My name is Ryan, and I lead the offshore wind commercial team within Esgian. As many of you know, each month we do host a short and efficient webinar. We do cover a current and relevant offshore wind topic. We do our best to keep these to the third Thursday of each month, and we aim to keep them to just 19 minutes. And we do this purposefully as we know your time is valuable, and our goal is to deliver high quality insights in a compact format. As I review the names in attendance today, I do see many in which I've had recent discussions and also familiar client names joining us. Welcome back. But for those of you that are less familiar with Esgian, we offer an award-winning subscription-based digital platform that provides transparency and clarity to the global offshore wind market. Our clients do include developers, companies within the offshore wind supply chain, vessel operators, consultancies, and more. And they're primarily using the platform for business development, competitive analysis, and strategic planning with data updated in near real time. On average, we're updating over 50 times per day. We've also recently launched a new tool that builds on top of our wind analytics platform. We're the first of its kind to monitor and quantify the power generation from operational wind farms globally. This feature is being used by investors, insurers, operators, and utility companies to support financial decision making. But for today, I'm especially excited as Oliver and I are joined by Alex from Venterra Group. Venterra is a leading offshore wind services company focused on accelerating the global energy transition. By bringing together a group of specialist businesses, they offer an integrated solution across the entire offshore wind project lifecycle, from development and engineering to installation and operations. Today's topic of discussion is particularly timely. We'll be discussing what makes an offshore wind auction successful and which emerging markets are worth watching closely. All of the insights that you'll hear today are backed by data from our wind analytics platform. And with that being said, it is my pleasure to hand things over to Alex from Venterra. Alex, why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Ryan, for the introduction, and good afternoon all. So let's begin. Auctions are a complex topic and include many things to think about. Auction regimes differ from country to country and from round to round, so one size doesn't fit all. Some auctions are seabed, some are offtake, and some are both. As such, today's session will cover some of the most important considerations, but by no means it's exhaustive or definitive. I'd like to highlight that also, given the complexity and limited time, we will mostly focus in Europe with a few exceptions. But let's start with basics. Without a doubt, developing an offshore wind project is complex and takes time. Auctions mark a first critical point in the process, offering developers key parameters and financial certainty. This step helps them determine if a project is feasible and financially viable before moving forward. The complex nature brings together many aspects like defining areas, setting capacity, outlining auction criteria, whether it's price or non-price, and lastly, clarifying offtake and support mechanisms available. We will talk about these later on today. But for now, a well-designed auction regime also offers future visibility, acting as a roadmap to achieve countries' ambition in offshore wind build-out. Furthermore, offshore wind projects rely on global expertise in supply chain, so geopolitical and energy security questions add to the already complex picture. But how are we doing with auctions among the complexity, geopolitics, and overall industry challenges? Last few years have seen a number of failed auctions, like Allocation Round 5, or AR5 for short, in 2023, which is an offtake auction in the UK, and it did not attract any bids from the developers due to the low strike prices. We can feel the impact of that now. Or a recent Danish auction, which didn't offer any subsidy, with other unattractive criteria terms, drawing zero interest. Or a new market like Lithuania, where government was forced to make adjustment following lack of interest. In addition, we also see that mature markets are forced to become more competitive. For example, with the UK adjusting allocation round pricing after failed auction, and currently consulting on auction round 7, allocation round 7, or Netherlands, reducing project sizes from 2 gigawatts to 1 gigawatts in this year's auctions. We also see that some markets like Ireland, South Korea, and Finland are moving away from so-called open door to more centralized, government-supported regimes. But why so few and so slowly? But before we dive into specific pillars, let's ask, what makes an auction truly successful? Winning bids is just the start. The real measure is how many projects secure investment and move forward, and how fast they reach the next stage of offshore wind developments and construction. Now let's look at some data. On the screen, you can see the graph showing awarded or planned to be awarded site concession rights split by maturity of the market. I'd also like to note that for the stage 2 auction, for the 2-stage auctions, which I will talk about a bit later, we count capacity at the seabed lease award stage. But going back to the graph, there are many ways to categorize countries, and sadly, they don't fit neatly into the boxes due to the complex nature of the offshore wind. To simplify, we've classified mature markets as those with already significant existing capacity, operational, and also clear future expansion plans, which gives developers, investors, and the supply chain confidence in the long-term growth. In this group, we've included Germany, the Netherlands, the UK, Belgium, France, and Denmark. I'll cover the new market category in a bit. So again, let's take a look at the graph. Even in mature markets after 2027, auction visibility declines. Only the Netherlands and Germany provide clarity through to 2029, while UK and Denmark have no confirmed auctions beyond 2025 and 2026. UK has yet to confirm future seabed auctions following this year's Celtic Sea round, which has taken place later on this year. But as UK follows a 2-stage auction regime, it offers yearly contracts for difference or allocation rounds, offering certainty. Denmark, meanwhile, faces uncertainty after a failed auction in 2024, with an anticipated new auction in 2026. It will be interesting to see developer interest in a market already rich with operational wind farms. Given ongoing uncertainties and geopolitical shifts, a clear long-term roadmap is essential. If governments want sustained offshore wind growth, they must offer predictability and stability beyond short-term cycles. Now let's turn to the new market category, covering the Nordics, Baltics, and Southern Europe, regions that all have held or announced upcoming auctions. It is shown on the graph that 2023 was a standout year for new markets, with Poland awarding 9 gigawatts and Ireland awarding 3.4 gigawatts of capacity. Together, this was over 3/4 of total capacity awarded in the new markets in 2023. What's quite interesting is that Poland led with a centralized government-supported auction system. But despite growing interest, delays and unclear auction rules have caused some developers to announce or indicate exits from some of the new markets. We think that this is due to the slow progress. However, there is also a different momentum, as most new markets now lean towards centralized auction models, except Sweden and Italy, which still follow an open door approach. Now, let's explore auction types, whether they follow a 1-stage, a 2-stage, or hybrid approach. A 1-stage auction combines seabed lease concessions with support mechanisms, but these vary again country by country, as one size doesn't fit all. In contrast, a 2-stage approach separates seabed leasing from a subsidy allocation. Regardless of the auction type, success is only realized when a project reaches FID or final investment decision. Ideally, the time from auction award to FID should be short to reduce uncertainty. So we are really looking for those mechanisms that facilitate this. Most mature markets use a single-stage model, with the UK being an exception to that, which uses a 2-stage model. Both systems have successfully delivered offshore wind capacity, especially in the UK and Germany. The question is, will they remain effective? More new markets are adopting to one-stage model, but we also see growing uncertainty. Some of the one-stage auctions have seen lower interest in recent rounds, leading to governments like Netherlands or Denmark being forced to reconsider the rules. Meanwhile, two-stage markets like the UK have faced project suspensions post-auction. So, having covered auction volumes and types, I'll now pass you over to Oliver, who will discuss support mechanisms and auction criteria. So, over to you, Oliver.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Alex. So in terms of support scheme, let's set the scene a little bit around support schemes. What's the context? And then I'll provide a couple of examples around how we might see this moving forward in the future. So let's start with some of the more obvious statements, and then we'll get into a few more of the more nuanced details around where we might be heading. As Alex mentioned, in the last couple of years, lease rounds, and that's whether it's a single allocation process or a two-stage process, in those recent years, developers have shown a clear preference for the security they feel is provided by a subsidy scheme, and then within that, notably CFD schemes. And this has shown itself in two trends. The first trend here is that countries that have had CFDs as a support scheme that's been in place, these are continuing. But we've seen some countries here decide to change the terms. So they're improving the terms that they offer to make them more attractive. The obvious example here, as Alex mentioned, is the UK AR5 in 2023 with no bids at all, AR6 in 2024, considerably more successful. And now we're looking out to AR7, hopefully at some point later this year, to see if the prices on offer are attractive enough to keep the UK on track for what is seemingly a challenging 2030 target now. The second trend that's already taking place is a return to CFD schemes for some countries that had previously moved towards cutting out these forms of direct subsidy support. So here we're looking at countries such as Denmark, where that change is now already underway. We're also looking at the Netherlands, where it now seems that they will revisit the terms they offer, although this does seem unlikely in the immediate future, given it looks like Dutch law would need to be amended to implement a successful CFD scheme. But we think it still will happen, but maybe a bit longer into the future. We're also closely watching to see the German rounds later this year, in particular how competitive this process in Germany will be, if we will see a continuation of the negative pricing that's been a factor in recent years, or if indeed there'll be increased pressure on the authorities to reintroduce a more structured form of subsidy support. So a lot of uncertainties there on some of these bigger countries, more mature markets. Ørsted released a report, more of a position paper at Wind Europe Copenhagen last month, and I would definitely recommend reading the report in its entirety. It's a really good read. In terms of subsidy support, the message from Ørsted was very clear. If there's no CFDs on offer, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, but not that much, without CFDs, then Ørsted is likely not interested in bidding. And this is an argument we've been hearing from a number of other key developers as well. This is certainly not just Ørsted in isolation. The key benefit of CFDs is the certainty they offer, as we all know, that certainty adding to much easier ability to raise finance, importantly at a lower cost of capital. And this then has a significant impact on reducing and bringing down the LCOE of a particular project. So if that's the major backdrop, some of the key trends, let's move on to a couple of other things that we want to highlight here. And for us, the most important thing here that's key is really flexibility in the CFD process. And this requirement for flexibility, this need for flexibility, is as true for the more established countries such as the UK, which this week announced some of the results from its recent CFD consultation process. The mere fact that these consultation processes are underway is inherently a good thing. But it's also true not just for those countries, but for some of the newer market entrants as well. And one example of the need and how you can approach this flexibility is in Japan. Now, clearly Japan, obviously not in Europe, but we think that this sort of behavior might well spread and give us some indicators for what might happen in the European markets as well. Now, in Japan, there's been a lengthy time period between the allocation award and then the start of construction, the start of installation. And this has led to some significant concerns around cost inflation, something that we hear everywhere, a global issue. The solution in Japan has been to apply index-based inflation to that CFD process, and we clearly think this type of flexibility will become more widely adopted. In effect, look at it as a more practical implementation of the CFD conditions. Another potential example of flexibility would be extending the duration of a CFD scheme, which would give more certainty around longer-term revenue flows. Suggestions are that this may possibly be seen in the UK with a 15-year terms stretched out to something like 20 years or so. One of the concerns that we hear being raised in newer offshore wind markets are concerns around floating projects. So this has been raised in Greece in particular, but is likely also going to be relevant in other new emerging markets that we see making good progress, such as Malta, for example. The issue is really that the authorities are going to be forced to offer what's a relatively high price for their subsidy support, and those levels will have to remain in place for 15, 20 years or so. And this is with a backdrop that costs for floating are expected to drop quite significantly over time, but the first movers in this market will have the highest support levels baked in for what will be a long time period. The only solution here really is for smaller countries to wait until they can be certain that the LCOE has declined enough to limit their exposure to levels that they're more comfortable with. And this is not intended, as Alex mentioned, to be a fully comprehensive view of all of the many issues surrounding subsidy schemes. We haven't got time really to get into issues such as differences between countries that have TSO support for substations and export cables, just as one example. Clearly an issue. But the key point here is that it's a very competitive world out there for offshore wind. There are plenty of countries that are trying to offer lease areas now and in the foreseeable future. And authorities need to increasingly be flexible and to remain flexible. For us, past success is no guarantee of any future success. So on to the final category here on non-price criteria. Non-price criteria that account for some 30% or so of the total points on offer in bid rounds and now well accepted in most leasing processes. In fact, the Net Zero Industry Act in the EU means that they're now mandatory in all renewables auctions. And these criteria can and certainly do cover multiple areas. Now, this is probably an incomplete list. I'm sure it is an incomplete list, but it does cover some of the key areas. Here we're talking about things like geographic sourcing, permanent magnets, supply chain resilience more broadly. For sustainability, things like recyclability, circularity, carbon footprints, biodiversity, things like systems integration, cybersecurity. The list really does go on and on. Point here is that the higher the levels of complexity in these non-price criteria, the higher the costs that will be incurred by developers in those bid processes. And then inevitably all of those costs will at some stage have to be passed through. And this complexity adds to the time and effort that it takes to put together a successful bid. The issue that we're highlighting here is not really whether or not non-price criteria are important to us. These are all significant issues, and there are very, very good reasons to build them into the bid process. The issue is really more around whether there is a common set of criteria or not. We've been doing a lot of work on sustainability as a non-price criteria in a number of auctions in Europe. So if we take sustainability, something as seemingly simple as reporting on expected greenhouse gas emissions that are incurred through the different life phases of an offshore wind farm. Now, over the last couple of years, thankfully, there's now a much clearer idea of the frameworks and the methodology that should be used. And this is something that's very, very welcome. However, On this issue, on this image, you can see the different sustainability and climate-related criteria that we've seen in different tender processes in some of these different countries, all of which are located in Europe. And there is something of a lack of standardization there. So firstly, there is currently quite limited harmonization of those non-price criteria across the different countries that you can see there, from one country to another. But in addition to that, the criteria can also vary quite significantly from tender to tender within one of those countries. Now, this means that a developer is forced to reinvent the wheel almost every time they're taking part in a tender process. And this is very resource intensive for all parties concerned, whether that's the authorities who have to judge and look at these different criteria within the bids, to developers, to the supply chain, because everyone ends up doing the same thing but different over and over again. As I said, increasing resource usage and complexity, particularly for those international developers that are operating in multiple countries. So, running a little bit over on time, so let's bring this together for our last slide into something of a conclusion. Developers and authorities alike both need to be prepared to adjust as the market moves. What worked 2 years ago might well not be appropriate now, and almost certainly will not still be appropriate 2 years into the future. We're clearly seeing interest in new sites dropping, and rounds have been struggling to remain competitive. After several years now with very large allocation rounds, the willingness to take on new projects without a clear, ambitious support scheme is significantly lower than it has been. As Alex mentioned at the beginning today, time is simply too short to go into every single component of what constitutes a successful lease round. But we've tried to highlight today 4 key areas for you. So making sure there are sufficient volumes that are on offer, providing a clear pipeline of future projects well into the future, ensuring that there's flexibility and attractive levels in terms of subsidy support, and trying to move towards greater harmonization of non-price criteria. Now, just last week, we had the bombshell news, which certainly took us by surprise, of Ørsted putting Hornsea 4 firmly on the back burner, at least for the next couple of years. And to end things, one thing that's indisputable, the key to a successful leasing process, which is the question we started by asking today, the key to that success will only become apparent once a wind farm is installed and power is finally being generated. So with that, let me hand things back to you, Ryan.
Excellent. No, thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Alex, both for your insights into what it takes to have a successful leasing process. If you do have questions, please type them into the Q&A at the top of the screen. But while we're waiting for questions, I do want to touch on a few items here. First and foremost, both Venterra and Esgian do have LinkedIn pages. We encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn, both for news and updates within the industry. You can see a QR code here for the interactive offshore wind map. This is a free map that we find a lot of individuals are using. So feel free to go to the interactive map and check that out. Also, both Venterra and Esgian will be in London in June for the Global Offshore Wind Conference. We both have booths, so we do encourage you to stop by to the booths. We always enjoy having the in-person discussions, not just over Teams. With that being said, let's see if there are questions. Well, we are when I do have a question myself, and I'm not sure if it's Alex or Oliver, but I'm curious on how project cancellations may be penalized.
I guess that's pretty in the media and social media, at least, even if not in the mainstream media, given the news last week. I'll maybe mention a couple of points, and then Alex, if there's anything that you want to pick up on that. I guess the easy cop-out answer from me is it varies. It's going to be very different from country to country. And I guess a lot of the noise in the last week has been people suggesting that the penalties are not enough. I guess the point I would make is that there's some indirect penalties that we've seen come into play pretty harshly. Instead, if we're looking at in a Hornsey 1 and a Hornsey 4 context, in Hornsey 4 context, clearly took some write-downs on that project, which then becomes some sort of indirect penalty, which was pretty significant numbers that we were talking about there. Maybe, I don't know if Alex, if you've got any other points that you want to bring up on that one.
I think another point is even if those penalties are kind of included in auction criteria or something, inevitably they will be priced in by developers and potentially, I think, push the prices up as well. So it's, if we draw the parallels with the non-price criteria, the more there is that is being asked, someone at the end of the day needs to pay for it. So where does that happen?
Yep, very good, very good. Now, thank you both for the feedback there. We don't have any other questions coming through. I do want to thank everyone for their attendance. We did go a little bit over, but that's I think that's okay. Next month will be the third Thursday, so we hope to see everyone again next month. And again, thanks for attending today. Have a great day. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.